Okay. And welcome to today's class. Christina, would you start us off with a prayer, please?
Sure.
Thanks.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're very thankful that we can learn more about the history of this world, and we ask that Thy Spirit may be here, that we may be able to do our best to understand the things that have happened, and that we may be able to relate those things to ourselves and learn from them. We love Thee so much and say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks a lot. I'm happy to have you here today. Okay, so today we're talking about Montesquieu, one of the great names of history. I always love looking at how many vowels there are in it. A very French name, to be sure. We'll be talking about The Spirit of the Laws, L'Esprit des Lois in French, from 1748. It's a great precursor to the revolutionary movement in France that we'll talk about as it escalates in the 1780s and then in the 90s. So here we go with Montesquieu for today. Welcome, Wendy.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. Hi.
Hi. Welcome today. Happy to have you.
Thanks.
Here is the Baron de Montesquieu. Charles is his first name. A side shot of him. He was, of course, French, a political philosopher and statesman, and another person who we've seen from history who had lots of money, and because he had money, he had time to consider these problems of political philosophy. And so once again, we see this elite class having the time and the means to write and to try to understand the scientific laws, if you will, behind political science. 1689 to 1755. It's very interesting that that Montesquieu, like perhaps most people, was much more famous after his death than he was during his life, even though he was popular during his life, especially in Britain, because he thought so favorably about the British Constitution. But he died in 55, and of course the revolution wouldn't come for another 30 or so years. He would be famous in the American Revolution, during American Constitution making, during the 1770s and 80s, and then especially also during the French Revolution, as we'll see. Well, it's hard to understand Montesquieu if you don't understand the French Enlightenment. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of our time talking about the Enlightenment here. This movement was from the mid-17th century, so 1650 or so, 1638 perhaps, if you look at Descartes, and go through the 18th century, so all the 1700s. So about 1650 to 1800. It was a reformist movement of ideas. The people behind it genuinely thought that they were making the world a better place. They were trying to do that. And so I think as we judge them, let's try to keep that in mind and understand
Mr. Gentile?
Sure.
So I think Wendy had a question.
Oh, okay. Wendy? You have a question, Wendy?
Yeah, just about his name. We call him Montesquieu, but is that like the name of a place that he was a baron of, and his real name is? Okay. So
yeah, exactly.
We're calling him by the name of the place he was from, then, essentially.
That's right. Yeah, the place that he inherited.
Okay.
Yeah. Excellent question. And I'm sorry I didn't hear you. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you.
Well, this French Enlightenment that Montesquieu was a huge part of, it paid tribute to the scientific revolution of the 1600s or the 17th century, and it stressed the application, as we probably well know, of human reason and the scientific method of experimentation. Basically, hypothesis, test the hypothesis, see if you can duplicate the experiment over and over again to prove something through what you can see. And they tried to apply these things, reason and the scientific method, to the improvement of society. Of course, with this reliance on reason, unfortunately for these men, in most cases there was a decrease in the reliance on advocated that reason was the primary source of authority, meaning it was more legitimate to know something than it was to know something through these philosophers. So with the premises, they questioned traditional beliefs, assumptions about truth and life. And so we'll see that from the Enlightenment on, we see a very, very different world as the globe starts to secularize more and more as these ideas diffuse throughout the world. And so let's look here a little bit more about some of these writers who were called philosophes. This is the French word from which, in English, we get our word philosopher. We have Montesquieu, who wrote The Spirit of the Laws, which we'll discuss today. We have Voltaire, who wrote Candide, social commentary. I'm not sure if any of you have read that one, but a slim book and an easy read. Diderot wrote a massive set of encyclopedias based on reason rather than understanding the world through faith or through the old ways, meaning tradition, culture, religion, etc. We have the Comte de Buffon writing a massive natural history in many, many volumes, trying to make sense of anthropology and trying to understand the diffusion of culture and specifically biology from the old world, or Europe, to the new world. And he had a theory of degeneration in which he said that the animals as well as the inhabitants, meaning the American Indians of the New World, were inferior genetically to those the Old World. Rousseau, The Social Contract, another incredibly influential book, and we'll look at that actually as our next document on Monday. So these are just some of the main writers here. Well, to sort of sum up this view of the Enlightenment, I have a quote from Diderot to Voltaire about his new reason-based set of encyclopedias. And so this is, you could think of it as a summary of beliefs of the French Enlightenment. Who would like to read this quote?
I can do it.
Okay, thanks so much, Heidi.
This shall be our device, no quarter for the superstitious, the fanatical, the ignorant, or for fools. How do you say that word? Malefactors?
Yep.
Or tyrants. I would like to see our brethren united in zeal for truth, goodness, and beauty. It is not enough for us to know more than Christians. We must show that we are better, and that science had done more for mankind, humankind, than divine or sufficient grace. Wow.
Okay. As we can see, a very large departure from society previous to this point. And these ideas, as I said, would spread, and you know, perhaps they seem almost second nature to us now because this is the type of society that we live in many ways. And so that's why we have schools like American Heritage that still show that we can learn by reason and by faith. And so I want to relate this now. What scriptures come to your minds when you think about this quote from Diderot to Voltaire? And what do we believe about reason and faith?
Oh, I guess the scripture that comes to my mind is the one about that, I don't know if it says that men become proud when they become learned, but something to that effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Heidi. What else do we think about this? Reason and faith.
What's the one that says to study with reason combined with faith, but I can't think of the words.
Yeah, Doctrine and Covenants 88:118.
Thank you.
Yeah, and actually I'll show that on the next slide.
And, you know, I think the previous slide, that quote is, you know, now, whatever, 200 years later, I think we've proven that science isn't enough for men to stay good. It just, when Heidi read that, I just felt like saying, well, good luck.
Right.
I think we've had evidence that they can't maintain that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you so much for that. You know, and it will be very interesting as you know, as we look at the French Revolution, really, because in so many ways the French Revolution is an outgrowth of this Enlightenment philosophy, and you really see what happens when you take faith in God and principles of divine morality out of the picture. And so it'll be very interesting for us as we study. Well, there's lots of scriptures, of course, about this discussion of, you know, balancing reason and faith. These are just some that I picked up here. What I'd ask you to do is just spend a minute or two reading them to yourselves, and then see if you can relate them to our discussion. What impresses you about one or a couple or all of these scriptures? What do you learn about this balance between reason and faith?
I really like the fourth scripture you put here about all things denote there is a God. Just kind of shows that there's a lot of people who say, well, I'm too smart for God because I'm a scientist. But really, God is the ultimate scientist. He created everything, him and his son, Jesus Christ. And so to realize that all of the things that people like to say, well, this is not related to religion, actually is, because God is the one who created everything. And as we study things with reason and faith, we can understand them a lot better, because it's kind of, God is at the center of everything we're studying.
Right, definitely. Thank you so much for that. And the image comes to my mind of a self-avowed atheist, worshiping the sunrise, saying, well, I don't need religion. I'll go and just worship the beauty of the earth, and that's all there is. But really, think of it, even in worshiping the sunrise, or these moments, these glimpses of great beauty in the world, they're worshiping God's creations, even if they don't acknowledge it. So thanks so much for that. What else strikes you about any of these scriptures?
That they're not mutually exclusive, that you don't have to choose faith or reason, that they work hand in hand. Yeah,
definitely, right? And in so many ways, the more I understand about the world around me, the more I appreciate God's hand in it. And they really do enforce each other. Thanks so much for that, Wendy. What do you think, Walter? Any ideas?
Well, this kind of goes along with what was just said, but 2 Nephi 9:29, it says, "But to learn is good if they hearken unto the counsels of God." And it is kind of saying that you can still be learned, and you don't have to you can still use reason. You don't have just to be faith. You can use reason as well.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that. Or we don't need to fear knowledge, right? We just need to see it in the right perspective. And I love this last one here. It's always been a favorite of mine. Doctrine and Covenants 101, 32 through 34. Yea, verily I say unto you, in that day when the Lord shall come, he shall reveal all things, things which have passed, and the hidden things which no man knew, things of the earth by which it was made, and the purpose and the end thereof, etc., etc. And I just love this because, we know everything we need to know for our salvation. There may be some things that maybe we don't know definitively in this earth, but that's okay, because we've been promised that we can know them someday. And that, to me, is exciting, that one day all the reason and all the faith will be able to reconcile, and we'll really see that God was just behind it all, and the abilities he's given us to reason with our minds are just one more expression of his divine grace and the greatness of God. Well, The Spirit of the Laws, a monumental work, incredibly important. And just a brief synopsis here before we jump into it ourselves. Certainly constitutionalism. Montesquieu absolutely loved the British Constitution. In fact, his book, The Spirit of the Laws, it was banned in France by the Catholic Church and by other groups. It was a banned book because, among other things, it talked so much about constitutionalism and put down monarchs in certain ways, even though in other ways it talked about the need for them. Of course, separation of powers is probably where you'll hear his name associated perhaps most often in our country with that phrase. Preservation of civil liberties. Rule of law and not of men. Talks about how we can't just have arbitrary rulers deciding things one day and then making another decision the next. We have to have a rule of law that applies equally to all people. Also ahead of his time in terms of advocating the abolition of slavery. Also ahead of his time in terms of the implications of putting French society into three classes, because these classes didn't include the feudal system in them. He talked about monarchy, aristocracy, and commons, and we'll see that the French Revolution will abolish feudalism, which will be a great legacy of it. He talked about the difference between two types of governmental power, sovereign power as well as administrative power. Sovereign power, as we've been talking about a lot in the Glorious and American Revolution readings we've done, is the source of all power, the people. And then administrative powers, right, this power on loan, executive, legislative, judicial. And he was incredibly famous for saying that these three branches of government were really what you need to have a good government, these three, instead of 5 or 6 or 8 or any other number, or 2, as was the tradition, actually. Three main forms of government: monarchies based on a principle, he thought, of honor, republics on a principle of virtue, and despotisms on a principle of fear. And it's interesting when looking at his views of monarchy, he meant a constitutional monarchy. And for despotism, that would be an absolute monarchy. So important to just note that. Okay, jump in and let's reason together. What is the relationship between a set of laws and the people governed by those laws. And there's a quote here that I'd like to read as we start thinking about that before our reasoning. Who would like to read this for us?
I will. Montesquieu wanted to understand why different people had the laws that they had. He asserts that laws should be adapted, quote, to the people for whom they are framed, to the nature and principle of each government, to the climate of each country, to the quality of its soil, to its situation and extent, to the principal occupation of the natives, whether husbandmen, huntsmen, or shepherds. They should have relation to the degree of liberty which the Constitution will bear, to the religion of the inhabitants, to their inclinations, riches, numbers, commerce, manners, and customs. In fine, they have relations to each other, as also to their origin, to the intent of the legislator, and to the order of things on which they are published, in all of which different lights they ought to be considered.
Thanks so much, Wendy. So what is he saying here, and what do you reason about the relationship between a set of laws and then the people governed by those laws?
Well, all you have to do is teach a primary class or a Sunday school class to know that the personalities of the children in your class are going to affect how you run the class.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. That's a really great example, and I've taught primary a few times, and I agree wholeheartedly with you. Let's see. Walter, we had an interesting discussion today during our tutorial about this. Remember you talked about Greece and Rome and the different types of governments they had. Would you like to share that with the class?
Sure. Well, kind of what we were talking about is that different types of government work differently for different types of people, and so in Greece, democracy worked really well because there was only a few people, and so that just worked well because everyone could have their say, and then that would just work well. And then in Rome and in America, you have a republic, and that works because there are so many people that if everyone got to have a vote and a say, then there would just be too many people and too many votes, and it wouldn't work out so well.
Yeah, and so instead, what do we have?
So yeah, instead we have a republic, and that works really well.
Yeah, excellent. And and in that republic, representatives. Thanks so much for that, Walter. That was a great comment. Well, if we relate this here, of course, I hope we think a lot about this, but why is it important to understand the laws of your country? Because this is exactly what Montesquieu set out to do. He tried to understand law for different peoples. Why is it important that we understand our laws?
Well, I would say so that you know which representatives you want to elect so that they have the same belief about those laws as you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks so much. Right, those things that govern us, it is certainly to our advantage to try to understand them because we'll have to live by them. And, you know, we want to have our say so that our representatives can hopefully do what we think would really be best for the community. With this concept that we'll talk about with actually Rousseau called the general will, what's really best for the community. Thanks so much for that, Heidi. What else would you say?
I think we want to understand laws so that we know how, where we stand and where our limits are so that we abide by them. Sorry, that's my baby.
Yeah.
But also so that we can make sure other people are abiding by them, whether they be our representatives or politicians, our neighbors, make sure that we understand when our rights are being infringed upon according to the law. So.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for that. Let's reason then. Hopefully you've been able to read a little bit of Montesquieu. Really a brilliant document in so many ways. What does he say about the three different species, as he calls them, of government? What are they, and how would you compare and contrast them according to what he said?
Well, he says that the three different kind are a republic government, a Republican kind of government, a monarchy or a despotic government. And a republican government is where the body or a part of the people have the power.
Mm-hmm.
A monarchy is when one person has fixed rules, and a despotic government is when one person basically has no rules.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Excellent. Excellent, Wendy. Thanks so much for that. Right from page 1, an excellent summary.
That was actually Heidi. Wendy would have said it
Oh,
much
sorry.
more
I meant,
eloquently.
I was thinking Heidi, but I said Wendy. I'm sorry.
Wendy would have said it much more eloquently. But
I saw you in my mind. Okay. Well, you know, it is interesting because he believed that in terms of republics, and I'm glad that you pointed this out, Heidi, that he said that there are two types of republics. Now, this is a little different than perhaps what we might think about today in some ways. He called them democracies and aristocracies. And so, as Wendy said, not Heidi, excuse me, as Heidi said, okay, we have the definition of a republic, right, in which we have government, okay, in where the body or only a part of the people is possessed of the supreme power, right? So the people have the power in some way instead of a king. But it's interesting because what is the difference then, perhaps, between what we might think of as a republic and the democracy and the aristocracy that Montesquieu calls both a republic?
I don't call a democracy a republic in my lexicon, but to me a democracy is what the Greeks had, and that's what Socrates and Plato and Aristotle all thought was a mobocracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. Right, and that is really, in fact, we have this little quote here, right? I mean, today, in many ways, right, political philosophers would talk about a republic as what we have, a representative government ruled by law. And then a democracy, okay, a direct government ruled by the majority, right, which can easily turn into a mobocracy, just as Wendy said. You know, and so just note that in the way he's using some terms, they're a little bit different than perhaps the way we'd understand them, even though his aristocracy is perhaps a lot more like our, what? Republic, right? Because we have these representatives. Montesquieu, and people faulted him for this for years, but he firmly believed in classes and hierarchy. He really felt that some people were better able to lead, and that the general people, they were smart enough not to make the big decisions, but to at least elect people who were better than them. He said they'd be able to tell who would make a good leader. And so that's why he talks about this aristocratic class, a class of nobles, and so he spends a lot of time talking about that, which is something that the French Revolution would not use him for, interestingly enough. Okay, well, let's talk about then how in Montesquieu's republic, either in his democracy or in his aristocracy, let's talk about exercising sovereignty through suffrage. Because, of course, once again, we have a philosopher saying, yeah, the people are ultimately sovereign, which is what we've been talking about. Think about, you know, Locke and the 5 big ideas. Same type of thing. But what does he say specifically about how the people exercise sovereignty, why they do, when they do, etc.?
Can I just clarify something? I know this says here, but it just shows you how ignorant I am. So when they use the word suffrage, they mean voting.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, that clarifies a lot. Okay.
Yeah, no problem. That's a great question, a great clarifying question.
I guess the suffrage movement was, the women's suffrage movement was the right to vote, correct?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. I'm just kind of slow. Okay.
Okay.
I haven't looked at your specific paragraphs, but what comes to mind from reading it was just that it seemed like he would say, but they're really, the general people aren't smart enough to vote on each specific law, but they are generally smart enough to pick a good representative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. And it is interesting because, as he says, and this is just from page 1, if we look down at the bottom here, paragraph 9, right, the people in whom the supreme power resides ought to have the management of everything within their reach. That which exceeds their abilities must be conducted by their ministers or their representatives. And so it's interesting to think that, you know, Montesquieu he holds up the people as a source of power, but yet he also, at least perhaps from our modern day perspective, kind of slams the people saying, yeah, you know, they're only good for so much, so don't put too much faith in the people. Okay, so let's see, what else here? There are lots of interesting things from these paragraphs if you want to refresh yourselves in here. What else does it say about voting?
Can I just add that sometimes I agree with Montesquieu because when we have initiatives on the ballot, there has never been a tax increase on the ballot that Utahns haven't voted for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure there's one 40 years ago,
right.
but ever since I turned 18, there hasn't been one, and so I sometimes have to agree with him.
Mm-hmm.
There have been things on the ballot that Utahns have passed that I know our legislature would not have passed.
Yeah, definitely, right. And that's one of the. I mean, think about the genius of a true republic or representative government. I mean, we do believe that people have talents in different areas, and why not have the best and the brightest and the best specifically suited to lead, right? In terms of politically. Why not have them make the decisions, whereas, of course, we can vote for those honest and wise men and women. So, Zeph, thanks so much for that, Wendy. Well, let's perhaps maybe look at maybe one of the others.
Okay, well, I do have a comment.
Sure.
On page 2, paragraph 2, which you have marked, the very first sentence is, the people are extremely well qualified for choosing those whom they are to entrust with part of their authority. Quite honestly, when I read that, I had to disagree, at least now, because I feel like people are not educated or they are being misled. So I understand what he means because, of course, the people have to vote for the representatives because otherwise then you have no say at all. But I don't think people have all the information they need to make the wisest choices. I know that I haven't always, and I really didn't know where to go to find it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it is interesting because, like I said, there really is this duality of the people can do it versus the people can't do it. For example, if we look down here, what is this? The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th paragraph on page 2. He says, as most citizens have sufficient ability to choose. I mean, that's a big assumption, right? According to what you're saying, Heidi. As most citizens have sufficient ability to choose, though unqualified to be chosen, right? So the people, though capable of calling others to an account for their administration, are incapable of conducting the administration themselves. And so it is interesting that he makes that assumption. And I appreciate your comment on that. It's interesting to me as well, if we look page 10, he talks about how, as in a country of liberty, every man who is supposed a free agent ought to be his own governor. The legislative power should reside in the whole body of the people. But since this is impossible in large states, and in small ones is subject to many inconveniences, it is fit the people should transact by their representatives what they cannot transact by themselves. And so it's interesting there because what is he saying? He's saying a couple different things at the same time.
Well, what? He's saying that we can't always keep government right close to ourselves. We can't always run under a democracy where every person votes. Sometimes we have to vote for a representative.
Yeah, no, very, very true. And it's interesting, too, as he talks about the nature of a republic. Remember, Madison had the idea of an extended republic, saying faction would counter faction, ambition would be made to counter ambition. Here he's saying exactly the opposite, saying, boy, to have a really virtuous republic, it has to be small. Because as he goes on to say, the inhabitants of a particular town are much more acquainted with its wants and interests than with those of other places. And so here we have this argument, and his argument, interestingly enough, would be by far the prevailing argument. Before Madison tried to turn that on its head and say, wait, we are in a particular circumstance here that's unique. See if it'll work, and we can judge whether or not it has in this extended republic. But just know that Montesquieu certainly favored a small republic as being the only one that would really work. Well, if we look then, because we've got lots of great stuff, of course, let's just relate this. I know Wendy has talked about this as what I can't remember how she's phrased it, but basically this is what she goes to when she wants to vote, or guide to voting, basically. Doctrine and Covenants 98. In verses 4 through 11, if you look here, right, and we think about our opportunity to vote, the responsibilities that we have, right, how do we choose people?
Well, like I've said before, to me there's only two qualifications, that they're
Mm-hmm.
wise, and that means in terms of the Constitution, and then the second thing would be honest and good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks so much for that. So that's verse 10 there, I believe. And of course, we know that, it's so interesting because when the people choose wrongly, right, well, the people mourn, right, because when the wicked rule, the people mourn, as we see from verse 9. Well, of course, lots we could talk about in terms of how we elect, and I know we've done that before, but let's move on with the reasoning and talk about his idea of a, quote, democracy. According to Montesquieu, what should be the foundational principle of a democracy?
Virtue.
He
Virtue.
said equality.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Was this the one where he was talking about equality?
Well, he talks about equality a little bit later, but he does first talk about virtue. So if we think about
I have
virtue
a lot of
then,
questions.
why is virtue so important? Let's relate this. Why is virtue so important as a principle of good government?
Well, because you want people to be able to govern themselves first, so you don't have to govern them so much.
Right. Definitely. And so if we think about this, there's this great quote from Montesquieu. It's actually very famous, quoted all the time, even today. Who would like to read this for us about virtue, about why we need it?
I can read it.
Thanks so much.
When virtue is banished, ambition invades the minds of those who are disposed to receive it, and avarice possesses the whole community. The objects of their desire are changed. What they were fond of before has become indifferent. They were free while under the restraint of laws, but they would fain now be free to act against law. And as each citizen is like a slave who has run away from his master, that which was a maxim of equity he calls rigor, that which was a rule of action he styles constraint, and to precaution he gives the name of fear. Frugality and not the thirst of gain now passes for avarice. Formerly the wealth of individuals constituted the public treasure, but now this has become the patrimony of private persons. The members of the Commonwealth riot on the public spoils, and its strength is only the power of a few and the license of many.
Okay. So this is what happens, right, when virtue is gone, and we can see time and again in history times when, because virtue vanished, right, there's only the power of a few, or, right, mobocracy, the license of many, right, to do evil to the government. Very interesting. I love this talk from General Conference, October 2009, just the past one. Elder D. Todd Christofferson spoke about moral discipline and how it applies to virtue. He said, by moral discipline, I mean self-discipline based on moral standards. Moral discipline is the consistent exercise of agency to choose the right because it is right, even when it is hard. It rejects the self-absorbed life in favor of developing character worthy of respect and true greatness through Christ-like service. The root of the word discipline is shared by the word disciple, suggesting to the mind the fact that conformity to the example and teachings of Jesus Christ is the ideal discipline that, coupled with his grace, forms a virtuous and morally excellent person. He then goes on and talks about how the societies in which many of us live have for more than a generation failed to foster moral discipline. They have taught that truth is relative and that everyone decides for himself or herself what is right. Concepts such as sin and wrong have been condemned as, quote, value judgments. As the Lord describes it, every man walketh in his own way and after the image of his own God. As a consequence, self-discipline has eroded and societies are left to try to maintain order and civility by compulsion. The lack of internal control, this could be written right in American Heritage's mission statement. The lack of internal control by individuals breeds external control by governments. One columnist observed that gentlemanly behavior, for example, once protected women from coarse behavior. Today, we expect sexual harassment laws to restrain coarse behavior. Policemen and laws can never replace customs, tradition, and moral values as a means for regulating human behavior. At best, the police and criminal justice system are the last desperate line of defense for a civilized society. Our increased reliance on laws to regulate behavior is a measure of how uncivilized we've become. And he ends by saying, in the end, it is only an internal, this is exactly what Heidi was saying, in the end, it is only an internal moral compass in each individual that can effectively deal with the root causes as well as the symptoms of societal decay. societies will struggle in vain to establish the common good until sin is denounced as sin and moral discipline takes its place in the pantheon of civic virtues. Moral discipline is learned at home. While we cannot control what others may or may not do, the Latter-day Saints can certainly stand with those who demonstrate virtue in their own lives and inculcate virtue in the rising generation. I loved that from conference, and it has so many lessons for what we're talking about today. Well, this is interesting because he talks about equality, which sort of comes out of left field in a way, but what does Montesquieu believe about equality in a democracy? And for help, you can see, I mean, he says a few things about it, but specifically we can focus on perhaps page 7, paragraphs 4 and 5.
I had a really hard time understanding what the heck he was talking about. Like, you know, I mean, obviously he's trapped in this idea of social classes and these laws about who can inherit what land and how, as if government had the right to divide it up. I don't really understand where he was coming from at all here.
Yeah, and in fact, go ahead.
It doesn't seem to be in sync with the rest of his writings.
Yeah, this really is, he wrote it in a confusing way. I think in many ways he was still trying to come up with his own ideas about it. And in fact, he talks about many different types of equality at the same time. And so it's interesting to try to figure out what kind of equality he's talking about when, as we'll see from the next slide. But one of the that I think is a core principle, if you sort of wade through a lot of the messiness of his thinking, is when he said here, and this is the 5th paragraph on page 7, all inequality in democracies ought to be derived from the nature of the government and even from the principle of equality. So how can having true equality in some ways lead to inequality in other ways? What might he be talking about there? Because I think once you hear what he means, you'll understand.
It's kind of like socialism, because if you have equality with your stuff, then like if you spread everything out equally with your stuff, then you have inequality, because the people that work hard will get their stuff taken and given to the people that are being lazy and sitting around doing not much of anything.
Yeah, definitely, and that's a great way to talk about socialism or communism. Interestingly enough, Montesquieu is sort of on the other end of things, thinking about how if you really had equality of opportunity that was enforced by the government, where people really had a chance to work hard, and for example, if all, I don't know, 5 or 6 of us in the class would get $10 an hour, no matter how many hours we worked, well, there would be an incentive to work harder. You could almost think of this as free market, right? So with the incentive to work harder, those who work harder, those with more talent, make more, right? They're able to enjoy the fruit of their labors more, which is interesting. And so having that equality of opportunity does create, as a result, an inequality of condition, right? Which is the opposite of communism, where you have a forced equality of condition, which then, of course, leads to exactly what Walter was talking about. And so I want to just talk, I mean, there are lots of different equalities in life, in scriptures. And so if we think about what we believe about equality, right, I mean, keep in mind there are many different types. Equality of worth as children of God would be one, right? Doctrine and Covenants 18:10, right? The worth of souls is great in the sight of God. Worth can't be diminished or changed, but worthiness can, of course. Equality before the law. Think of the rule of law and not of men. If Wendy steals something, she should get the same punishment as if I steal something. Equality of opportunity. When we think about that, that's sort of that ability of, okay, everybody who has the ability to work hard and who has talents can rise to greatness, right? Can earn the fruits of his or her labors. Equality of condition, very different type of equality. Think of communism, trying to make everyone the same in possessions. There's voluntary equality. Think of fourth Nephi, right? Think of having all things in common, or no poor among them, but voluntarily done, willingly given, as opposed to forced equality. We're going to make everybody the same. You could think of perhaps welfare programs in some ways. Whether you like it or not, we're going to use your tax money to do things with it that we think will help people and level society. Equality in real civil rights. we hope that equality in things like free speech and freedom of religion will be honored. At the same time, we have equality in alleged civil rights, as Elder Oaks spoke about, with different groups that try to say, oh, well, this is a right too, so it has to be protected, when perhaps it's not a right. Or as he would say, it is not a right, and as I would agree with him, of course. Equality of truths or perspectives, and this is what we call moral relativism. And so, like I said, there are many different ways to think about equality. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. But what do we believe about it?
I like the first three, not the fourth one. I like the fifth one, not the sixth one. I like the seventh one, not the eighth one, and not the ninth one.
You got it. I tried to mix them up for the class, you know. So, yeah, definitely. Well, you know, there's lots we could say about this, and we'll actually spend several weeks talking about different iterations of socialisms, you know, Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, et cetera, et cetera. And so just something to think about. And as Wendy said, this really is a confusing part in Montesquieu, but I think it's also something that we need to realize is complex, because of course there are some that are good and some that are bad, as Wendy said. Well, let's talk about liberty. He's one of the great, what you could call advocates of liberalism, you know, advocating liberty and sort of restraint from old regimes, which in some ways could be bad, in other ways could be very good. And so what does he say about this? Page 8 has a lot of clues. What would your reason?
I like the one about government has to be set up so that one man not be afraid of another, and then he just goes through idea after idea of, well, if you do this, there won't be liberty. If you do this, there won't be liberty. So he's setting up this idea of checks and balances.
Excellent, excellent, right? That is exactly it. And in fact, his conception of liberty ties directly into his idea of separation of powers, which he fleshed out in a very famous way. And so I love this here. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, just sort of explaining Montesquieu's ideas about liberty. Liberty is not the freedom to do whatever we want. If we have the freedom to harm others, for instance, others will also have the freedom to harm us. And if we will have no confidence, and we will have no confidence in our own safety. Liberty involves living under laws that protect us from harm, Montesquieu directly right there, right, while leaving us free to do as much as possible, and that enable us to feel the greatest possible confidence that if we obey those laws, the power of the state will not be directed against us. And Elder Oaks from the Divinely Inspired Constitution, you probably noticed we've referenced that a lot. Elder Oaks talked about how the most desirable condition for the effective exercise of God-given moral agency is, I love this, a condition of maximum freedom and responsibility. In this condition, men are accountable for their own sins and cannot blame their political conditions on their bondage to a king or a tyrant. This condition is achieved when the people are sovereign, as they are under the Constitution God established in the United States. Well, I know we're going a little bit fast here, but I want to make sure we get to three sorts of powers and separation of government, of powers, excuse me. So what are these three sorts of powers in a government that he mentions?
Did you see my little scripture on the side?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see it.
I referenced this a couple weeks ago, and I didn't know the scripture source, so I looked it up today because I wanted to prove that Montesquieu wasn't the first one to come
Right.
up
Oh,
with
yeah,
this.
yeah.
Because Isaiah talked about a judicial, and a legislative, and executive branch many years before.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, and I totally agree. You know, Montesquieu, he took ideas that had been floating around in many forms for, as we can see, hundreds and hundreds of years from this great scripture that Wendy cited, and he refined them in terms of putting them all together in sort of the one-stop shopping mode, which we seem to like, of course, you know. And so very much like Locke, right? Not a lot of new ideas, but perhaps put them in the best package. And so they're cited over and over again. Thanks so much for that, Wendy. Well, if we look then, I was really excited about this smart art here, and separation of powers, right? What does he say about these separation of powers, and what does it have to do with these little diagrams that I've created for us?
You know, I didn't get this far in my reading, but just common sense and looking at the diagram would mean that under liberty they work together. They have to balance each other out. They have to be checked against each other. And under tyranny, they're just all separate and they don't check each other.
That's an interesting way to think of it, and I definitely agree about the sharing of powers in a separation of powers and giving us liberty in that way. One of the things, and we have to try to imagine here, think of this as a cup or a funnel held in the hands of one ruler, an absolute monarch, for example. And he, because it's usually been a he throughout history, he would be able to hold this cup in his hands, and he would be the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches all in himself. And so, what are the dangers of having one person have the power to wield all three of these together, rather than having them checked and balanced against each other by being separate but also sharing powers?
Well, he can create bad laws. He can he can enforce bad laws, and he can also, put people in jail that he doesn't agree with. I mean, he just has all power in every situation.
Yeah, definitely, right? Excellent. That was what I was trying to say. Well, we'll talk a lot more about this. But were you able to pick up on the fact that to be truly separate doesn't mean that they all operate independently of one another, but that they really do need to share the same powers so that they can check against each other? Was that, how did you about that in the reading? Welcome, Brad. Well, let's continue on then, because here's an example that might help us. We're thinking about Johnny with his 10 friends at a birthday party. He makes a rule that he does not have to share his cake with anyone. His friends object loudly, and he listens to their case. Nevertheless, he judges that his rule will stand. Then he executes his rule by eating all 12 pieces of his cake in front of his teary-eyed friends, who then stomp home to tell their mommies. How would the situation be different if the powers of birthday party rulemaking, rule judging, and rule executing were separated? Describe an alternative scenario for me, please.
Well, if Johnny was the rule maker, then he could say, "Oh, I think I get all the cake." But then you could have another friend who was the rule judger, and he could say that, "No, I don't think that's fair." And so then Johnny, he could say, "Well, I think I should get 3 of the pieces." And then maybe the rule judger would say, "Okay, that's okay." And then another one of the friends could be the rule executor, and then maybe they don't think that's such a good idea, and so they won't execute it. Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, so.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that, right? I mean, of course, many ways, I'm sure those of you who have managed a birthday party can understand why separation of powers would be more effective than rule by Johnny and his absolute tyranny over his friends. Well, if we think about this then, how must powers be separated in order to prevent tyrannical or ineffective rule? What do we think about this?
I liked the idea, that he said you could, even if you only had separation of the judicial, that if legislative and executive were combined, but that the judges were your peers, and they could at any point say, well, this isn't a fair law, so we're not going to punish you. That even that gives you a measure of protection. Yeah,
definitely. Right, that's a great check. The rule maker and the judge. Thank you so much for that, Wendy. Any other ideas on how these powers must be separated? We've talked a little bit about this before when we discussed the Constitution. Well, for the sake of time, let's just jump over here. There's quite a science to it. I tried to simplify it as much as I could. Hopefully, it'll still be clear. But if we look at the U.S. Constitution as a model of effective separation of powers, right? Of course, we have a 3-way separation as opposed to the traditional 2-part separation of rule maker and rule enforcer. We have legislative, executive, and judicial, of course, as we well know. It's not a total separation because, of course, that would risk deadlock. or one in which one power can gain total control of the others, which risks tyranny. Separation of powers is, interestingly enough, enhanced by sharing powers in a checks and balances system, right? And so, of course, as we know, these three things that are very fundamental. Each branch has one, some authority to act on its own; two, some authority to check the other two branches; and three, some authority that is checked by the other two branches. And so, of course, because of this, the same kind of powers must be shared, right, to maintain the strength and independence of each branch. And then, of course, at the root of all of this, right, you can't take the people away because the people are the source of power. All powers are derived from their sovereignty. Okay, well, quote here, President J. Reuben Clark, quoted by President Ezra Taft Benson in his The Constitution, a Glorious Standard. Let's see. Christina, would you read this for us, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
It is this union of independence and dependence of these branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, and of the governmental functions possessed by each of them, that constitutes the marvelous genius of this unrivaled document. It was here that the divine inspiration came. It was truly a miracle.
Thanks so much. And I've always found cause for pause when President Clark said that it was here, in separation of powers, that the divine inspiration came. It's very interesting to think about how important this might be, and I think it's something that, at least, I think it's been easy for me to take for granted growing up with it. Well, if we look then, I want to think about some lessons for our relationships, right? What can we learn from separation of powers for our relationships? What do you think? And in fact, just for the sake of time, let's relate this here to these three things, because it's sort of the same question, but a little more detail, but we're almost out of time. What do you think? Have you ever thought of separation of powers and relationships before?
Well, that was going to be my answer, was in my relationship with my husband, our best parenting decisions are the ones that we work together on.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Wendy.
This is Brad. I came in late to class, but I did get this question. One decision my wife and I made back in October. It was a pressing decision. We had to make it. I had one opinion. She had another opinion, and we called our bishop to get his opinion, because we were kind of at a stalemate as to really what to do. And it wasn't a battle. It wasn't a heated thing. It was neither one of us really knew what to do, and so we said, okay, well, when we come to an impasse, let's go to the judicial,
Right.
and let's get his opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that example, Brad. I appreciate it. And I love thinking about this. This was a revelation for me, as I was learning this. As I thought about this and tried to relate it, the relationships between priesthood and motherhood in families and in the big picture of the plan of salvation is really like separation of powers. Think about it. Women can't hold the priesthood. Men can't create and grow babies in their bellies. But yet, right, they're both so essential to the unfolding of God's great plan of salvation. With motherhood, we have spirits that can come into physical bodies in the world. And yet, with those physical bodies then, we have priesthood ordinances that are so essential for exaltation. We think about exaltation, of course, it's a family affair. A man and a woman need to balance together and be married in a temple, and only, right, righteous priesthood and righteous motherhood coming together can produce exaltation. And so, of course, right, two parts of a great whole in the gospel plan. And, of course, we have, by divine design, we do have roles, separation of power, so to speak, but yet, right, working together to make things better. Well, there's lots more we could talk about with this, of course. I would encourage you to look at the slideshow. Of course, unfortunately, we're out of time. I do have a PE class I have to get to. But I just want to point out to you some things maybe you could look at on your own time if you'd like. Montesquieu's influence on the U.S. Constitution. He was quoted more than any other philosopher during the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Madison quoted him specifically in Federalist 47 over and over again as the great oracle talking about these issues of separation of powers. And then perhaps you could walk through a simulation with your family if you want. I thought it would be a lot of fun with an issue here, some roles, and then an objective to simulate America's system of separation of powers at work. Anyway, I'm grateful for the comments we've had today from all of you. I appreciate learning from you. I'm grateful for the class that we have, and I really look forward to Monday talking about Rousseau, and I do hope that today was fruitful for you, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks so much for everything.
Thanks, Nick.
Okay, take care. Bye.
You.
Bye-bye.